So it's safe to say that DMRs haven't really had the best reputation amongst Fortnite players. So the idea that we are in the DMR meta right now sounds crazy, right? What is going on, my fellow Fortniters? And in today's video, I'm going to tell you guys that we are in fact in a DMR meta and why the IQA-11 Marksman Rifle succeeds where the other DMRs have failed. If you guys enjoy this type of content, make sure to like and subscribe for more videos. Also, let me know what your thoughts on the IQA-11 Marksman Blaster is, and if you think it is a better long-range weapon than the A280-CFE, because I will also be talking about that weapon in this video as well. So without further ado, let's get on with the video. So to understand why I think the DMRs are so hated, we have to look at two components. One of the major components, and probably the biggest component, is competition. The first ever DMR was actually an okay weapon. It had high damage with a slower fire rate, which I actually didn't mind because I was more concerned with actually hitting and dealing damage with the weapon than just hitting as much shots as you can possible. Because with a DMR, it's projectile, so you have to account for bullet travel and then also your enemy's movement, which is something that hit scan AR doesn't have to worry about because you're hitting the target that you're aiming right at. So the Striker Burst and the Red Eye were just much better weapons in those seasons because they filled in the same role as a DMR, but they were hit scan, so it was much easier to be consistent with them. The Cobra DMR was a much faster firing but lower damage DMR, and while a lot of people actually liked that, I thought it was much worse because now the weapon was even weaker at long range, and if you wanted to compete with like a closer range weapon like the Hammer AR, it was not going to be ideal because the Hammer AR was just much better because it was hit scan and it had higher damage output. And then at long range we had the Hunter Bolt Sniper, which was able to one-shot headshot and had 3 shots in the mag. So this weapon couldn't even be like a more forgiving sniper rifle. It was just a much worse like middle ground between the two. But you couldn't really run it like in like a 2-gun loadout because this weapon had like no hip fire accuracy, and then also it was just really weak at long range. So overall, I was not really a big fan of it. And then in Chapter 4 Season 2, it was even worse because we had the Red Eye. So I don't really think I have to explain why the Red Eye is better than the Cobra DMR. And then we had the Excalibur rifle. I'm actually not going to talk about this weapon, I just wanted to mention it because I know it's a DMR, but it doesn't really fit, like it's not really like the other DMRs in the video, so I'm just going to give it a mention because people are going to ask me about it. Here it is. Alright, back to the real DMRs. We have the Thermal DMR, which is my least favorite DMR they've ever had. It had a much faster fire rate, but the damage was even lower and it had a lot more recoil. So if you wanted to use this weapon at long range, it was not ideal, especially when you were comparing this to the MK Alpha and the Mammoth pistol, and then also the Red Eye and the Heavy Sniper before they got vaulted. This weapon was just not it at all. Some may argue that it's better at close range, but I really don't ever want to use a DMR at close range, especially since we have like much better close range options anyway. Like that season we had the MK Alpha again, the Combat SMG, and the Flapjack rifle. So I don't know why I would ever want to use a DMR over those. And then in Chapter 4 Season 4 we had the Tactical DMR. This DMR was okay, but like it was more similar to the normal DMR, so it did higher damage with a slower fire rate, which was okay for me, but again, this weapon was competing against the Twin Mag and the Suppressed Sniper, so it wasn't really that useful at all. And then in Chapter 5 Season 2, we got the Huntress DMR, which was actually amazing. This was a higher damage but slower firing DMR, which is all I could ever ask for a DMR. Like this thing had really low bullet drop, really fast projectile speed. This thing was incredible. It was competing against the Reaper Sniper Rifle, but that weapon had a much lower spawn rate that season, so I would find myself actually using the Huntress DMR in my matches until I could find a Reaper Sniper Rifle, And it didn't feel horrible to use. Like, this thing was actually pretty good if you played around it right. But again, the Reaper was still a much better weapon. And now we are at Chapter 6, Mini Season 1 with the IQA-11 Marksman Blaster. This weapon is very similar to the Huntress, but much better in almost every way, dealing very similar damage from 63 to the Uncommon and 76 to the Mythic. It had a much faster fire rate than the Huntress DMR with a fire rate of 1.9 and a much higher headshot multiplier with 1.95. This thing was able to hit for 148 for a Mythic version, and that is not bad headshot damage at all. The blue version of this weapon is able to two-shot players in 0 build. Like, that is the lowest rarity that can two-shot players. This thing is insane. This weapon does have some competition, however, and that is going to be the A280-CFE Blaster Rifle. This is our red dot AR of the season. But this weapon actually isn't as overpowered as some of the other red dots that we've had. It does 27 for a common and 35 for the mythic as far as body shot damage goes, which is the exact same as the Holo Twister. But unlike the Holo Twister, this weapon has a relatively slow fire rate of 4.25, which makes this weapon's damage output quite weak, and it's actually comparable to the IQA-11 Marksman Blaster. But the difference between these two is that this weapon has no damage fall off, which is something I forgot to mention for the IQA-11. This weapon has no damage fall off while the Huntress DMR did. So the damage output for the IQA-11 is going to be the exact same across all ranges, while the A280-CFE is going to lose a lot of damage since it has a damage fall off number of around like 70%, which is lower than the Holo Twister was. So this weapon is going to be a lot more like the tactical AR, where it's a low recoil, really accurate weapon that doesn't have the best damage output, which I think is great because like these weapons, if you're going to have a really easy to use red dot AR, it's going to need to have a much lower damage output, which is why I like the tactical AR. I think it works really well in reload mode, and I think this weapon works pretty well in comparison to the IQA-11. It's much easier to use because it isn't projectile, but it's not going to have as much of a damage output as the IQA-11. So overall, I am actually a pretty big fan of the A280-CFE, not because it is a great weapon, but because it's really balanced compared to the other red dots. Like, this weapon is going to be able to give other like third-person ARs a chance to be viable in the loot pool, and I think that is really nice. Like, while I do like red dot ARs and I do prefer using them over the non-red dot ARs, I do like when the game is really balanced and like there's different playstyles that can be encouraged. So overall, I'm a pretty big fan of this weapon. Another thing that makes the IQA-11 so much better than the other DMRs is the environment of the season. Now, when I was talking about the Huntress DMR, I completely skipped the part where it was in Repped. And that is because the problem with the Huntress DMR in Repped was much more different than the problems that the other DMRs were facing. As for long-range weapons, the competition actually wasn't that bad. The other long-range weapons were quite balanced, but the problem with the season was how much mobility it had, so any fights that were like really slow-paced and long-range were completely obsolete that season. But this season, as you guys probably know, we have hardly any mobility. We only have shockwaves and like vehicles, which makes much more room for like long-range, slow-paced fights. And I think this is an area where DMRs like this can absolutely thrive. Like, you can hit a really hard-hitting headshot, and there's not really a lot that your opponent can do. You can pretty much just push them and you've probably won the fight. Like, this weapon is insane for pressure. And then also the fact that heals are much less common this season makes this weapon even more deadly. If this season did have more mobility, I might be more inclined to use the A280-CFE over this because it is a hit scan weapon, making it a lot easier to track players using mobility. But since this season is pretty slow, I just prefer the IQA-11 Marksman Blaster. So overall, I believe the IQA-11 Marksman Blaster is the best long-range weapon this season, and also the best DMR that we have ever had. And the A280-CFE, while not as good as the other red dots, is still a welcome addition to the loot pool because it is very easy to use. And that is really all I have for this video. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to like if you did, and subscribe for more content like this. Tomorrow I will be uploading a tier list video, so if you want to see where a lot of the weapons I've talked about so far are ranking, make sure to stay tuned, and then I'll also talk about some of the other weapons I haven't made videos on. Don't forget to have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.